somebody asked me upstairs as I was coming into the room, which part of Ukraine I'm from. It's Australia. To answer the question, is Russia a new imperialist power? My answer is the negative. It's not, no. It's a very old imperialist power. It's a power that has been growing since 1482, and with 6 expansions, exceeded 20 million square kilometers by the First World War. It was the weakest of the European imperialist powers on the eve of the First World War. And it was also an imperialized power by big financial interests of the West European states. And that is why it collapsed under the pressure of the First World War. But it was an imperialist power already, conquering a periphery that extended right up to the territories conquered by the other European powers, all the way to China, to the Pacific, to the Baltic, to the Black Sea, and to the Carpathian Mountains. Now, I suppose the question arises in everybody's head, well, what about the Soviet period? Did this end Russian imperialism as a structure, as a state and military and economic structure of domination and oppression of nations by the Russian nation? That's what I mean when I talk about imperialism. Well, in terms of economic relations, it's a very mixed picture, because we do see the emergence of the non-Russian peoples from largely peasant, rural, illiterate existence to fully mature social structures and the acquisition of the capacity to rule themselves quite independently by the time the Soviet Union ended. But this was a very uneven process. But what is more important is in the Soviet period, in the Stalin period, let me be precise, the Soviet state used extra economic means, state bureaucratic means, to oppress and to deny the right of national self-determination to the non-Russian peoples through repression, through the extermination of national Bolshevik and communist leaders of the non-Russian peoples, through famine, through migration, through the resettlement of Russians to the non-Russian republics. And if you study the economics of the period, the result in terms of socioeconomic development was the uneven development of the nations, of their social structures, of their opportunities in life. If you look at their languages, the same thing happened. And so one cannot say that Russian imperialism, and yes, of course, great Russian chauvinism, as an ideology of Russian imperialism, you cannot say that it disappeared in the Soviet period. And after the 10-year hiatus that, under Yeltsin, that Catherine spoke about in the previous presentation, we see the restoration of a capitalist imperialism for the second time, of a Russian capitalist imperialism, in the roughly 15 years of the rule of Vladimir Putin. For the Russian establishment, the collapse of the Soviet Union, as Putin has said, was the greatest single tragedy of the 20th century. This was not a tragedy of the collapse of the Soviet state in the way that we understand it for them and for him. It was the collapse and the loss of a periphery that the Russian ruling nation had acquired over a period of over 500 years. That was a big tragedy for them. And that is what part of the current project of the Russian state is all about, to reclaim that periphery. Under Putin, there has been quite an explicit strategy for the restoration of of Russian imperial rule. First, from around 1997-98, to reclaim the near abroad, the immediate periphery around Russia through a state-led strategy of promoting several national economic champions in the fuel, energy, and mineral sectors to take back the markets and the processing and transiting assets of the former Soviet republics around Russia, namely Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, Armenia, and Kazakhstan. And in the second period, to use that reclaimed territory on the immediate periphery to pave the way for Russian transnational corporations such as Gazprom, Sistema, Norilsk Nickel, and others, to pave the way for their entry into wider markets, wider consumption markets, investment areas, and technologies beyond this immediate territory, so they can achieve transnational competitive status. The paradox of this process is that the Russian economy has been very weakly driven by domestic demand as it has grown, and it does not satisfy its domestic demand. It is not a diversified economy as a result of this growth, nor is its bourgeoisie interested in diversifying that economy. Property ownership is too insecure in Russia, and markets and strategic resources are in the gift of state authorities. So it has been more profitable for the oligarchs who have accumulated wealth from the exploitation of raw materials and energy resources to invest those proceeds beyond the Russian Federation. And they have invested them beyond the Russian Federation in economies that are more diversified, more technologically superior to the Russian one, and which afford them security of the ownership of their property and their investments. So the paradox is that while the Russian national economy is not diversified, Russian capitalism is diversified, and is diversified sectorally and geographically along transnational lines of production, consumption, and investment. What are the destinations of that investment? Deutsche Bank report in 2006 showed that by that year, Russia was the largest of all the BRIC, was the largest overseas investor of capital overseas, outside of its own borders, of any of the BRIC countries. And in 2006, it was investing $160 billion US. It was the second largest investor in the so-called emerging market economies in the world, after China, after Hong Kong. Let me be specific. And if you look at the structure of overseas investment by Russian capitalists around 2008 to 2010, 52% was invested in Western Europe. Around 20% was invested in the near abroad countries, that is to say immediately around the Russian Federation, and about 10% in East Central Europe. How much time do I have, please?
Another 7-8 minutes, if I'm not.
Okay, let me just get a water, please. to the Ukraine crisis. The Russian state has been targeting Ukraine for reintegration into its economic, security, and diplomatic space ever since the Ukrainian state became independent. Its leaders have for years been saying to Ukraine's leaders, when are you going to give up your little game of nation building? When are you going to finally give up and return to the fold? Why? What is the rational, as opposed to ideological or sentimental reason, why Russia would want to prioritize the reintegration of Ukraine into its sphere? Apart from the fact that it was the second biggest Soviet republic, it was economically highly developed, it had a quite diversified industrial sector, it's in the south, on the Black Sea, so on and so forth. But the main reason, as I understand it, well, the main reasons are, number one, Russia retained, or Russian state and private corporations retained ties with the high technology sectors of the Ukrainian economy, notably defense industries, aerospace, aeronautical, and shipbuilding, and they wanted to hold on to them. Secondly, the oil and gas pipelines, which take over 80% of Russian oil and gas out of the Russian Federation to overseas markets, run through Ukraine. And Gazprom and its state sponsors were determined to secure control, full control, ownership of these transit facilities. Thirdly, Ukraine holds the processing plant for important Russian raw materials being exported abroad. Minerals, as well as oil. And finally, Ukraine is on the westward path of transnational investment of Russian capital abroad into Western Europe. And without securing Ukrainian economic territory and its assets and its strategic objects like this, the Russian imperialist project could not break out westward. Its capital could not move out westward and invest upstream from its base industries in energy, minerals, into higher profit, higher technology sectors of the global economy. Thank you. 5 minutes. Secondly, Russia calculated correctly that it would not be challenged by the United States of America and its NATO allies in Europe if it sought to subordinate Ukraine. I use the word subordinate advisedly here because I don't believe that the Russian state has ever sought, really, to conquer Ukraine and to rule it as it once did, as a set of provinces of the Russian state. In terms of strategy, though of course not of scale, the Russian model of imperialism is quite similar to that of the United States in the 20th century. And that is to provide military security to a country in exchange for that country's agreement to subordinate itself to Russian foreign policy, and to open up Russian markets to that country's businesses for trade in exchange for that country opening up its borders to direct Russian foreign investment. That is the basic deal that Russia has sought with Ukraine, with all the countries in its periphery, as the model of creating the zone of its economic territory and creating the tributaries through which the Russian heartland accumulates wealth from those countries that enter under its umbrella. Militarily, Putin calculated that NATO would not respond, not only because it hadn't responded in 2008 to the Russian attack on Georgia, but because, nor because it saw that the US became an increasingly reactive rather than a proactive power in Central and Eastern Europe, but because Russia is militarily stronger than NATO in its own near abroad. To make an abstract comparison between US military force or NATO military force and Russian military force, to my mind, explains very little, if anything at all. One has to talk about the capacity to make a real allocation and deployment of military force in specific places. And NATO has neither the logistic capacity nor the subjective will, I should add, to intervene against Russia when it seized Crimea or when it armed the separatist insurgency in eastern Ukraine. Not only that, NATO's European allies, in the first instance the Germans, the French, the Italians, are not prepared to commit NATO forces to the defense of NATO forces in Eastern Europe, such as Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, should they be invaded by Russia. And that became very clear a few months ago when direct questions were placed to the leaders of those countries, those NATO countries, whether they would do so. And they said no, they would not. So Putin calculated, rather correctly, how far he could go. Putin's ambitions were much greater. He wanted to seize 8 provinces of Ukraine. He seized 500 square kilometers of 2 of them. So his bargaining position is much weaker today. But nevertheless, I believe he calculated correctly. As the Estonian defense minister said in June of 2015, Putin believes that he enjoys regional superiority. And in the military sense, on his immediate borders, he does. Finally, I know I've got a couple of minutes left. I'd like to say something about the changing balance of powers in the region. Russia and the European Union are vying between one another to incorporate Ukraine into their respective integration projects. That is to say, the European Union on one side and the Eurasian Economic Union on the other. On the European side, the most important, and I see European Union as a kind of a sub-imperialism of global American hegemony, for reasons that we could talk about, but I do see it as an imperialist project, but of a subordinate kind to a larger one. The biggest state on the European side in this effort is Germany. Germany is the biggest investor of any country in the world in Russia. And Russia gains entry for much of its foreign investment into the European Union through Germany. And the relationship between the technologically most powerful and economically most powerful state in the West and the most endowed, as far as resources are concerned, state in the East is a critical one. And what they are most concerned about, these two states, is to resolve the so-called Ukraine crisis as to restore what have been rather dynamic economic relations, certainly up to the 2008 financial crisis. The conventional wisdom on the left is that the United States of America, as the hegemonic power in Europe, will intervene militarily if it is threatened by an upstart power. I ask the question, well, what would happen if American leadership in Europe is challenged from within the alliance by a country like Germany that wants to change or that has its own strategy of normalizing relations with the Russian Federation, which has deep economic interests in its ties with the Russian Federation that the US economy does not have. What would happen if that occurs? And I think that the Ukraine crisis, I'll finish on this, is a potential point of bifurcation between NATO allies, principally between Germany and the United States of America, over the Ukraine crisis and relations with Russia. Azerbaijan. What is the extent of Russia's borders is a kind of unanswerable question. Russia historically expanded as a land-based empire, and it knew no borders. It only came up against competing imperial powers, and that was when it stopped. In the present period, Azerbaijan occupies this interesting position. First of all, it stands between Russia and Iran. A significant number, there's a significant Azeri minority in northern Iran. And so this is both Azerbaijan and the Azeri minority in Iran are objects of joint interest for Iran and Russia. Secondly, Azerbaijan elite is trying to find an independent route to Western markets for its oil. It is quite self-sufficient in terms of its capacity to earn, as long as it can find that route. And unfortunately, the pipeline heading west that the Azerbaijan has been trying to consolidate runs through Chechnya, for one, in the Russian Federation, and two, through Georgia. And if you want to look for the reasons for, one of the reasons for the Georgian-Russian war in 2008, it was to block Azerbaijan's capacity to break out through to Western markets. But thirdly, Azerbaijan and Armenia are deadlocked for years now, since 1990, over Nagorno-Karabakh. And here the Russian state plays a very interesting sort of game as well in playing off Armenia against Azerbaijan, arming both of them, giving each one concessions and so on and so forth. So Azerbaijan is in Russia's orbit, but its leaders seek a way to break out. And Western powers have tried to help Azerbaijan break out in some way by, first of all, including them in an alliance of states that has been referred to here already. The European Union has tried to do that through the Eastern Partnership group of countries. Well, that's basically where it stands at the moment. On NATO and Russia and their military, this was raised earlier as well. What is the real balance of forces around Ukraine? Let us say in terms of Russia and NATO forces. It was really revealing what happened in Wales at the summit. Was it the NATO summit? Yeah, last August. Poroshenko came away with absolutely nothing that he asked for. He was not going to be armed. I know there are American advisors in Ukraine, and there are some who are training forces there. But neither the US nor NATO are supplying Ukraine with lethal weapons. Some NATO countries, very small NATO country like Lithuania, have promised to, but this is really not serious. So, NATO is concerned first of all to secure its own member states and it doesn't have the capacity to do that in an event of a crisis should, to my way of thinking, should Russia make a move northward to the Baltic states. And that is a cause of great concern. Russia, on the other hand, has military bases beyond its border in the former Soviet, in 8 of the former Soviet republics, 8 of them. And it has been building them since 2003. It announced in January of this year a $310 billion US program to further militarize to 2020, and only this week it announced that it was building a completely new air base in Belarus, in addition to the air base that it already has. In addition to that, the Russian Federation is building 2 military bases on the Ukrainian border right now in Belgorod Oblast. So the Russian capacity to strike in the neighborhood of Ukraine is far superior to the NATO one, and it is growing. And I think one needs to take that on board. Looking at the bigger picture and this long argument, or this long claim that has been made about NATO expansion into East Central Europe. I agree, NATO made an expansion into East Central Europe, but that happened, and we are in a period since the 2008 financial crisis and the Russo-Georgian War, when the US is really a reactive force and is not committing in kind to the Russian military buildup. I'll just say finally on Great Russian chauvinism. Yes, in the 1920s, it was mitigated by a very active program to build Communist Party among the Communist Party sections among non-Russian nations, to undertake a program of to make people literate in the native languages, in the trade unions. The non-Russian languages became the language of work in the trade unions and in the government organs. But that was all successfully whittled away and suppressed, not completely by any stretch, least so in the Central Asian republics, more so in almost completely in Belarus, but less so in Ukraine, but hardly at all in the Central Asian republics under Stalin and under Khrushchev and under Brezhnev. Finally, my comments on Russian imperialism you can read in the next issue of Critique, where I've got a big article on the Ukraine crisis. Thank you.